The UK Supreme Court ruled today that under equality law, a woman is defined as a biological female. The landmark judgment sided with the campaign group for Women Scotland, which brought a case against the Scottish Government, arguing that sex-based protections should only apply to people born female and not trans people with a gender recognition certificate. Delivering the ruling, Judge Lord Hodge counselled against reading it as a triumph of one group over another. He stressed that trans people are still protected against discrimination under the Equality Act, which he referred to as EA.
Interpreting sex as certificated sex would cut across the definitions of man and woman in the EA, and thus the protected characteristic of sex, in an incoherent way. It would create heterogeneous groupings. Other provisions will function properly only if sex is interpreted as biological sex. Those provisions include separate spaces and single-sex services, including changing rooms, hostels and medical services, and communal accommodation. It follows that the interpretation of woman in the Scottish Government guidance on the 2018 Act is incorrect, and the challenge to that guidance succeeds. The correct interpretation of the EA as referring to biological sex does not cause disadvantage to trans people whether or not they possess a gender recognition certificate. Trans people have the rights which attach to the protected characteristic of gender reassignment.
The ruling represented defeat for the Scottish Government, but ministers at Holyrood said they would accept it.
We were upholding the law as we saw it existing, and that was the advice we were given. Of course, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, so their interpretation and their ruling and judgment today changes that interpretation of the definition of a woman under the Equality Act 2010, and that means that guidance will have to change in the light of that.
So just how significant is today's development? We got the thoughts of the senior lecturer in law, Dr Nick McKerrell.
This decision overturned the decisions of the Scottish courts in this judicial review over the definition of sex within the Equality Act 2010, and by doing so it clarified the position for people that have gender recognition certificates and have transitioned to another sex on that certificate, that they don't have the protections of sex under the Equality Act 2010. What it will change is that there is still protection for people with gender recognition certificates. Trans people still have protection, but it's in the protection as a characteristic of being somebody that's gone through gender reassignment in that process. And therefore, they will be protected. What they won't have protection from, though, is the sex. So they won't be protected for sex discrimination. If they were a trans woman, for example, they won't be protected as a woman. So the very specific thing that this case was about was the Scottish Government's law on equal representation on public boards, where men and women would have equal numbers on that. The Scottish Government's definition of women included women who had transitioned and had a gender recognition certificate as a woman. They wouldn't be included on that board. That guidance is now illegal in the rules of the Supreme Court. So in that very specific thing, that's a change there. But that broadly means that people with gender recognition certificates won't get the protection under equalities law of their ascribed sex. Now, the change of this judgment might mean that the providers of same-sex spaces may now argue that because trans people do not have the protection of their transition sex, that it is proportionate to exclude them from same-sex spaces, for example, exclude them from women-only spaces, because they could say it's proportionate because the laws recognise that they don't have the protection of women. But that might not happen. It won't happen immediately. It will be, I think, what services decide to do on this. So they will have to consider this ruling and what it means for their provision of services. It's a very momentous case which will take a few days to really digest exactly the implications of it, but it won't make things different overnight. It will be a longer process.
For women's rights groups like for Women Scotland, this was a day of celebration.
Our women's rights are women's rights.
Activists maintain that their campaign has been about defending women's rights rather than undermining trans rights. We spoke with the campaigner Rona Hotchkiss. So, what is your reaction to today's ruling, first of all?
Well, obviously I'm delighted, but to be honest, Rona, it's more a feeling of relief. that this long, long battle is over, that the law has been clarified in the way that we wanted it to, and we can now move on with bringing common sense back into the policies and practices of particularly public bodies.
The judge today said that this shouldn't be seen as a victory of one party over another. But do you think the way Women for Scotland were kind of behaving today, outside court, cracking open the champagne, as you can see in the picture there, drinking a glass of champagne, was that the right note to take?
Well, I think particularly for Susan and Marion, this has been a very personal struggle, and this has come at great cost to them, to their family lives, to their professional lives, and to their own sense of well-being and so on. And these women have suffered multiple threats, abuse and so on. So I think it's understandable that sense of euphoria quite literally spilled over today, and I would never condemn them for that. I can totally understand it. But they were very, very careful to say today that this is not about being anti-trans. It's about ensuring that women's rights are clarified in law. So I don't think it was triumphalist. I think it was just a massive sense of relief and delight.
So it is clarified in law. So what's this ruling going to mean in practical terms?
What I think it will mean is that there will be a lot of public bodies in Scotland and across the UK scrabbling around tonight, looking at their policies and practices, perhaps realising that some of the voices that they tried to silence were quite correct when they said self-ID is not actually legal. In Scotland, you don't have to do this. You don't have to allow men to identify as women and then use women's changing rooms, participate in women's sports, use women's refuges. And I think there'll be a lot of policy revision going on tonight.
So do you think then that trans women, someone who identifies as a woman, will be able to use a woman-only changing room now?
No, I don't. I think that some people will try to keep that going, but I think it'd be very, very difficult to defend, because if you say it's a women's changing room, now by law, trans identified males, men who identify as trans, are not women.
But the problem with that is that the judge has said today that there can't be blanket exclusion of trans people. The test of proportionality has to be met in each case.
Yes.
So there are still going to be very much grey areas.
There will be grey areas, but if you, for example, if you think that proportionality might be that women feel uncomfortable, threatened or whatever, changing in front of males, then I think that's an argument that will now win the day. Because if you're talking about things that are designated as women's spaces, I honestly think, Rona, the way to go forward is to create third spaces, where if people aren't at all bothered changing in front of males, if women aren't bothered, they can go in there and trans people can use them. I think that is the only reasonable and rational way forward.
Members of the trans community have said today that they feel this is an attack on them and they're really deeply anxious about what the future holds. Do you have sympathy for how they are feeling this evening?
I do, because I think that many trans people have been whipped up into a state of hysteria and panic about this. This ruling today has not removed any rights from trans people that they had before. What it has done is clarify the law, and people like For Women Scotland, the LGB Alliance and so on, always said that the law was being distorted by organisations like Stonewall. Well, this has laid that to rest and should make it very, very clear now that biology is immutable, sex means male or female, and you cannot identify into another sex.
They also feel that today's ruling is going to lead to more discrimination.
I'm not sure how it can, Rona, because the law still protects them. The Equality Act lists protected characteristics, and transgender status is one of those. So they will still be protected under the law, and if anyone is discriminated against because they are transgender, then they can take action based on that.
The trans rights campaigners say the rhetoric used by For Women Scotland, which led the campaign, has been anti-trans and abhorrent. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think that it's possible to point to individual words that may have been misplaced or said wrongly, but in general, no, anti-trans rhetoric is not a thing that For Women Scotland do. It has come to be the case that even if you stand up for women's rights in relation to spaces, services and sports, that's considered anti-trans rhetoric. And you only have to look as far as MSPs, particularly from the Green Party, who consider anything that is said in defence of women's spaces to be transphobic. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
And do you think gender critical views, or people that have gender critical views, are going to be able to be more open about their views now?
I think it will perhaps give courage to people who feel this way and who've not felt able to speak up for fear of losing their jobs or their livelihoods or whatever. But I don't think it will make people more transphobic, as it were, because it's never been about that.
OK, Rona, thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Well, the ruling was met with disappointment within the trans community. Campaigner Ellie Gomersall joined us in the studio. As a trans woman, Ellie, how are you feeling this evening?
I'm pretty gutted, actually. I think this ruling this morning, I think it undoes 20 years of understanding that a transgender person who has obtained a gender recognition certificate is able to be, for almost all legal intents and purposes, seen as the gender that they really are. I think that this ruling undoes that. It's a complicated decision and it's a complicated piece of legislation, and it actually, in terms of the number of people it is actually going to directly affect in terms of the law, it's actually a really, really small number.
Some members of the trans community have been saying that it erodes their rights, but the judge was very clear today. I mean, he said that the Equality Act still provides trans people with protections against discriminations, so that hasn't changed.
So it's complicated, and this is what's so challenging with this sort of thing. So there are some protections, for instance, for the protections under the characteristic of gender reassignment, which that doesn't change at all today. The protections in the Equality Act under the characteristic of sex, that's what this judgment was about. So that means that if someone who's, for example, a trans woman like myself was discriminated against because I'm a woman, then that would no longer be protected under the Equality Act, except for there's complicated circumstances around it. But
so
that's
you
the
feel your rights
line.
have been eroded?
Well, absolutely. And I think the thing is as well is that this decision, it only actually impacts trans people who have a gender recognition certificate, which is incredibly difficult to obtain. I've been waiting on waiting lists for 7 years
and you don't
here
have
in
one,
Glasgow.
do you?
I've not been able to get one because the NHS waiting lists for a diagnosis that's actually not even recognised by the World Health Organisation anymore are so hard to get. But the thing is that even though I don't have a gender recognition certificate, I think this is still going to have a massive impact on my life.
Well, in what way? What's going to change in practical terms?
So I think that there will be organisations and in some cases individuals as well who'll see this ruling as a vindication or justification to discriminate against trans people in any particular way. And the reason I say that, I mean, already NHS England, for example, down south, have said that they're going to be reviewing their policy for things like hospital wards. But actually, at the moment, you don't need the gender recognition certificate to be put in the hospital wards that matches what your gender is. So there are decisions that are being made on the basis of this ruling, based on people's interpretation of this ruling as well, which I think we'll find out more about in the coming sort of days and weeks, where decisions are then being made that don't necessarily match what this ruling is exactly about, but have really widespread impacts for the whole trans community.
Do you think it's going to make your life more difficult? Do you think you might face more discrimination because of this?
I think so, and I think part of that is because perhaps the response that some organisations might have, where they might say, actually, you know what, if you're a trans woman, for example, you're not welcome in this space, and that would be really, really challenging in and of itself. But actually, I think some of the other impacts are the sort of social impacts of this as well. So in recent years, hate crimes against trans people have absolutely skyrocketed across both the UK and in Scotland as well. And that makes it really difficult for us as trans people to just go about our lives day to day. And I think that the ruling this morning, I think, will be seen as vindication for certain groups. I think it will be seen as justification in some ways for...
But can you understand why these campaigners wanted this definition? I mean, it's to protect what they see as biological women's rights. Do you have any sympathy? Because they have sympathy for the trans community tonight. We spoke to someone earlier. Do you have any sympathy or empathy for what they're going through?
Well, I think it's really important for us to look at what this decision was exactly about. It was about quotas on public boards. So it was about representation on public boards. That was what this whole court case went through, all the different levels of court in Scotland and now the UK. And fundamentally, I think that if we've got more diverse voices, including trans people on things like our public boards, then that's a good thing for diversity. So I don't think that actually this whole legal challenge, I don't think it really benefits anyone. Instead, I think that it's an attempt to roll back trans rights, as we've seen in recent years. The group that brought this court case to the Supreme Court, for Women Scotland, when you look at some of the rhetoric that they've been using about trans people, including about myself specifically, friends, people that I love, the horrible, horrible things that they say online about us. And when you look at a few years ago,
well, I think they would maybe say in their defence that they don't feel that they've been using toxic language.
Well, I would suggest having a look at some of the language that they have been using. It's all publicly available on social media. I would say that it's extremely hurtful and transphobic in many cases.
OK, well, we'll have to leave it there. Ellie, it's such a complicated story, but thank you so much indeed for joining us this evening.